The sky's the limit for Jessica Ravel.
What I was looking for was someone like me who was working towards an amazing future.
She shoots for the moon and finds a superstar.
He was charming. He was attentive.
But when his dark side brings her back to Earth,
he was really a master of manipulation. I didn't know what was real and what wasn't.
She wishes he'd never set foot on the planet.
I was in a state of terror and fear that I didn't ever think I was going to get away from him.
It was sort of like they were getting prepped for surgery. That's when he would remove them from the bar and take them back to his apartment.
My instincts were telling me when I woke up that morning that everything was wrong.
It was dozens and dozens of people who had the same experience.
Someone was going to get hurt. It was just one big exercise in sexual violence. I started college as a musical theater major. And I went on to be a history major, and I focused on medieval and Renaissance British history, which was not the most practical thing that I could have majored in. At a certain point, I needed to get more practical about what I was going to be doing in my life. So I decided I was going to go to law school.
24-year-old Jessica Ravel grew up in New Jersey and is in her second year of law school at Rutgers University when the unthinkable happens nearby.
Okay, it sounds like we have some breaking news to tell you about out of New York. There's a
fire burning in the World Trade Center right now. We're just hearing about that right now.
Afterwards, I wanted to do something to help. Eventually, it kind of came to me that the skills of being a lawyer translated into being able to work in the intelligence community or service in the Navy. It was a place that I really could contribute and do something towards helping after 9/11.
With a vision for her future now crystallizing, Jessica sinks herself into her studies, leaving little time for leisure.
Everything was just going really well, but going into the winter of that year, I realized that the thing that was missing in my life was a guy. What I was looking for was someone like me who was working towards an amazing future. I complained to one of my girlfriends that there just weren't any good men in the world anymore, and she laughed and said, "Oh man, do I have the guy for you." He's in the Navy, he is a doctor, he's really just intelligent and funny, and I think you would get along well with him. So I was all like, yeah, bring that on. Let's see where that could go.
It's early December when Jessica heads down to the Hard Rock Cafe in Philadelphia for a blind date with Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis.
I got there first, and when he walked in, I was honestly kind of underwhelmed. He walked in a black t-shirt and black jeans, and he was really pale. And he had this kind of weird flat top haircut. Not too flattering. I mean, not unattractive, but not attractive either. It definitely wasn't love at first sight. Jeff told me that he grew up on the West Coast. His mother ran a school. His father was a pilot. He talked a lot about how he was a flight surgeon in the Navy and his work as an emergency room doctor. There was something I found attractive about him. He was funny, but he was also arrogant. Looking back with hindsight, I think that I made excuses for that. So after the date, Jeff walked me to the train station, and there was no goodnight kiss, which was fine with me at the time. You know, I wasn't sure even that I liked him.
And Jessica isn't sure whether Jeffrey likes her either, until she gets a call from him the following week asking for a second date.
I said, yeah, why not? I didn't have a bad time with him, so why not go out with him again? When we went out for the second time, we actually decided that we were going to get Chinese food and watch a movie at my house. So he came to my door, and before he even walked through, he said, "Hey, Chunky Butt, how are you doing?" And I just kind of looked at him, and I was like, what woman wants to be called Chunky Butt? So I actually said to him, "Hey, could you please not call me that, because it's just not cool." I was a beauty queen. Like, I spent time in a swimsuit being judged on my appearance. Being called Chunky Butt, like, at that time, it was just so not true.
It's an awkward beginning to their evening, but the tension eases up.
We set up the movie and started eating, opened a bottle of wine, and, just talked. We were having a pretty good time, and we got through most of the bottle of wine, and suddenly, I have no idea what happened. I do remember being in my kitchen and him kissing me. And that was the last thing that I remembered until the next morning. All of a sudden, he's in my bed, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what did I do? I totally didn't mean to do that. That wasn't on my agenda for the evening. There should have been no reason for me to black out after, let's say, half a bottle of wine. Even if I had drunk the entire bottle of wine, blacking out just isn't something that happens to me. So kind of waking up not remembering anything was strange.
That blackout period, that time she can't account for, to wake up and not know why or how somebody is still there, that unknown is very scary.
Jessica doubts herself to the point where she wonders if Jeffrey will have a bad opinion of her for sleeping with him so quickly.
But when he woke up, he told me what a great time he had last night. So I just said to myself, you know what, like, I might as well at this point go out with him again, since we've already gone there. And that morning we went for breakfast. And at some point it turned into a relationship that at first was really nice. He was charming. He was attentive. We talked a lot about having a future together and what that may look like. I remember we went to dinner one night in an Italian restaurant. And this restaurant had kind of an alcove where there was a table for two. No one had ever done something like that for me before. It was very romantic. So at some point, the relationship, it just worked. We were happy. I was happy with him. I was happy with where things were going. He was a good guy. And I was looking forward, into what a future might look like with him.
The relationship becomes serious, but the demands of Jeffrey's job means their time together is often disrupted.
He would frequently call me and say, all right, sorry, I got to go off and save lives. And then he would come home and tell me that, he had saved a baby or a pregnant woman or, something that would really just pull at the heartstrings. That made me feel good that I was dating this guy who really helped people.
It's been barely 2 months since they met, and Jeff goes radio silent for periods of time. Jessica becomes suspicious until one night when he tells her he has an important confession to make.
He said that he was a non-official cover agent for the CIA. He said that he had gotten special permission to tell me because I was someone who was special in his life, who he felt like he was going to have a future with, and that I needed to know and understand who he was and all of him. It's not that he wasn't an ER doctor and he wasn't a flight surgeon. He was, but they were both a cover for what he did for the CIA.
It's a little over a year since 9/11, and fighting terror is on everyone's mind.
That was a major milestone in our relationship. It was clear that he felt like I was someone he wanted to be a part of his life. In fairness, that was flattering to me that he would get special permission to share something so important, with me. There were periods of time when he would go away, that I wouldn't know where he was or where he was going. And during that time, he always said that it was because he was off fighting terrorists.
It will be years before Jessica discovers the unfathomable truth. about what Jeff is really doing while undercover.
Marsalis was audacious. He was bold. He felt that he was never going to get caught.
It was just a very Jekyll and Hyde existence.
I took a sip of the drink that was mine, and I don't remember anything until I woke up the next morning. I was in his bed. I had no clothes on. He was next to me. I was very confused.
Jessica Ravel is getting deeper into a relationship with Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis, hoping that one day they'd get married and become a power couple.
He was helping people, and that was really attractive to me. We talked a lot about a future together and what that would look like with me as the lawyer, him as the doctor.
In January 2002, Jessica and Jeff go to Bermuda for their first weekend getaway.
When we first landed, it was freezing, and there wasn't anyone around. We got to the hotel. I think that it was under construction because it was an off-season. It was not the most romantic environment for a trip.
Jeff suggests they rent a scooter. They ride out to a remote beach, but the journey is far from idyllic.
I started getting scared. Because it was dark and we were the only people there, I told him that I wanted to go back, and he told me no, and he just kept driving. He was swerving the scooter in a way that felt dangerous to me. He was laughing in a way that just felt incredibly unhinged, and I remember just crying and telling him I wanted to go back, and he was like, "What do you think, I'm gonna kill you?" "I'm afraid. I want to go back. You're not wanting to take me back, and that's just scary."
This could be a test on Jeffrey's behalf of scaring her, but then showing her that nothing's going to happen and he is her protector.
Finally, Jeff climbs on the scooter and they ride back to the hotel.
By the time we got back to the hotel, I was just a total mess. I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't want to be there. And it was one of those situations in which he started telling me, "You're going to have to learn to have my sort of sense of humor."
Jeff's strange mood continues, and he seems intent on baiting Jessica.
He proceeded to tell me about a time that he and his friend, who was also in the CIA, saw two guys coming out of the club, and they thought, let's pick a fight. So they picked a fight with the guys.
And this is when Jeff drops a bombshell.
He ended up killing one of them, and his friend put the other one in the hospital. He told me that when the police came, he basically showed them his CIA card, and he got right out of it. That should have been a moment that was just a huge red flag. And I know it sounds probably ridiculous, but he had a way of normalizing things that were just ridiculous and horrible. This is an example of something that I've done with one of my friends. And if you can't appreciate that, then we're not going to be able to have a future together. He had this training, and sometimes instinct just took him somewhere that, normal people don't go. I think that I rationalized that it was part of what he did as part of the CIA.
On another trip, Jeff's vanity is on full display.
We went on this Disney cruise, and then we spent a couple of days in Florida. Jeff was obsessed with taking pictures of him in different settings and different poses and different states of dress. He got really dramatic with the way that he posed. He would, kind of put his head back and smile. And I just found it really strange that he was so obsessed with having these pictures of himself. The one thing that he did express interest in was becoming an astronaut. We then go to Cape Canaveral, where he decides that he needs a picture of himself in an astronaut costume. I remember asking him, well, why do you need to do that if you're going to go to astronaut training? He was like, well, it's just a fun thing to do. After we were done with the photo session, he was very excited about the picture. He actually gave it to me as a gift.
On their first Valentine's Day in 2002, Jeff tells Jessica he wants to show her where he works.
Jeff said he had something really special planned for us, and we went from his apartment to the hospital. He seemed to have access to everywhere. He then proceeded to take me to the cadaver lab. He opened drawers with dead people, showed me different organs, and suddenly he ripped off the guy's arm and then chased me around the cadaver lab with it while he laughed maniacally. I was terrified, and he told me it wasn't a big deal. He asked me why I thought it was such a big deal.
When they return to his apartment, Jessica is furious.
I remember grabbing my bag and just telling him I was leaving, and he blocked the door. He wouldn't allow me to leave. It was just one of the first times I saw behind the mask.
Despite this deeply disturbing incident, Jessica and Jeff continue to see each other. And in the summer of 2003, Jessica graduates from Rutgers Law School.
I took time and did some research into where I might want to be. I ultimately ended up enlisting in the Navy as an intelligence specialist.
Over the next year, Jessica launches her new career as Jeff continues to serve the Navy and CIA in his undercover capacity.
He would be going off on what he called missions. He's playing me recordings of what he says are him interrogating terrorists in Afghanistan, and all I hear is screaming. He played those things for me pretty regularly. I was 24, 25, and at that age, I didn't have a lot of experience with the world. It seemed like, oh my gosh, I knew what the CIA was from movies and TV, and what he was telling me made sense.
Jessica thinks the pressure of Jeff's work or some unknown stressor is making him increasingly controlling.
He started isolating me from my friends, getting me to a point where I needed to rely on him for comfort, for friendship, because I just didn't have anyone else. Either I stopped talking to them, or my life was just getting too crazy with him and they stopped talking to me. I came to think that this was just my life and something that I needed to deal with, because if I didn't, people were going to get hurt. He talked about killing people, so there was definitely a part of me that was quite sure he was capable of doing that to me or people I loved.
Jessica becomes scared in her relationship.
I just started looking for coping mechanisms. I would literally go to the gym and do an aerobics class and then run 10 miles a night, so I had an excuse to not be near him. I trained for a marathon so that I wouldn't be able to see him on weekends because I was just afraid.
After more than 2 years of dating, Jeff pops the question in April 2004.
You would think like getting engaged is supposed to be this like happy, exciting thing. But by the time that, he brought it up, I was already in that state of terror and fear that I didn't ever think I was going to get away from him. So I said, okay. And that was it.
But unbeknownst to Jessica, Jeff is leading a sinister double life.
I totally lost my 20s to this horrible, horrible person. And they're not something that I can ever get back.
After their engagement, Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis asks fiancée Jessica Ravel to accompany him on a trip out west.
His dad was his idol, so it was just a really big deal that I was going out to Park City, Utah to meet his dad. We went skiing, we went shopping. From what I recall, we did a lot of nice things on that trip. Seeing the normalcy of the family really made me question, like, where did he come from? Because they were just so kind and welcoming.
But it remains a stark contrast to Jeff's disturbing and frenetic energy.
He busts open the drawer and just starts screaming at me. He's got a shotgun and he's pointing it at me and he's just screaming, "I'm gonna kill you." When he was done screaming, he took a pause and he looked at me and said, "Just kidding," and turned around and pranced out of the bathroom. I think at that point, I was just so broken down. I let it go as one of those things that I needed to deal with in my life.
Back in Philadelphia, Jeff's abusive behavior continues.
I remember being on the phone with him, and I didn't care if he killed me. I didn't care if I lived. Like, I just couldn't deal with him anymore. And something just, clicked in my head. And I said, I can't do this anymore. And I hung up on him, and I immediately called 911 and said I needed help. I needed help. And as they were sending police over, I called my mom and I told her everything that was happening. And, it was kind of one of those, like, why didn't you tell us moments?
The police arrive and escort Jessica safely downtown to file a temporary restraining order.
It could have gone the wrong way any number of times. Handling it the way I did actually may have saved my life.
Soon, Jessica will learn that she is not alone, because Jeff's undercover work for the Navy and CIA has been a cover for something completely different.
It was March of 2004 when I began communicating with Jeffrey Marsalis. It was a time in my life where I was interested in getting married and having children.
Joanne Bottaro Cooper is single with a successful career in marketing when she decides to give online dating a try.
Jeffrey Marsalis's profile looked like he was a good catch. He had pictures of him in his medical scrubs with an astronaut's uniform. He had a lot of other pictures. Jeffrey said that he wanted to meet me out for a date, and I said yes. I lived in New Jersey, so he planned for me to come into Philly.
They go to a popular Irish bar in Philadelphia, the Tur Na Nog, where he describes his thriving career as an astronaut.
I was excited because he actually looked like his profile. As we were chatting and sat down at the bar, he started describing his residency program and the NASA program, and I was interested. He was interesting. He lived in a high-rise apartment building in the city that was also just a few blocks from where we were. So we went down to his apartment. He asked if I wanted a drink. I said no to an alcoholic drink. So I just wanted something non-alcoholic, whether it be water or soda. I sat down on the couch. We started to talk a little bit. He did kiss me. I then took a sip of the drink that was mine. And I don't remember anything until I woke up the next morning. I was in his bed. I had no clothes on. He was next to me. My head hurt. Every part of me hurt. I was violently ill. I knew I had sex with him. There was no question. But I didn't know why, because I had no intentions of staying over in his apartment, of having sex with him. I blacked out for probably about 8 hours. There's nothing in between my taking the sip of the drink and then waking up the next morning. I chalked it up to maybe not having enough to eat on Friday.
When Marsalis wakes up, his reaction seems to indicate nothing is amiss.
He started chatting with me like everything was normal, like what we did was normal, and I didn't say anything to him that I didn't remember anything. I just kept it all to myself. So I had assumed that I, wanted it, and I can't really explain it. I wish I could, but I can't explain it to myself. I just figured I would just forget about it. I was just gonna put it away and move on.
Over a year after Joanne dated Jeff, Jessica gets an unexpected call from the manager of his apartment building.
She called me and said, hey, I think you need to call the Philadelphia SBU. And I was like, oh, okay. Why? What happened? And she said, just call them.
Jessica immediately reaches out.
You know, I remember them asking me questions, and some of them were about him dating other people, and I had no idea.
The special agents tell Jessica that Jeff is accused of raping at least 2 women while she has been engaged to him.
You know, at first, I don't know if I was in denial. I understood what my experience was, but as they were asking me questions about what sounded like the experiences of other women, like it just, gosh, I don't even know how to explain it. There came a point when I was talking with the detectives that like kind of a light bulb went off, and it all kind of came together. The last couple of years of my life were basically one big date rape. I came to understand that it wasn't just me, and that was just so scary.
I have to almost laugh at that. Let's get over the profile. And eventually we're gonna see me as the person who I am inside. The caring, the loving, the nurturing, the easygoing, the great guy.
In March 2005, Philadelphia's Special Victims Unit launches an investigation into Jeffrey Marsalis.
The first victim that came in said she met him on a dating website. Well, they went out on a date. She said they had a couple drinks, went back to his apartment. She woke up with him on top of her. And then wake up the next morning, he kind of sweet talks her into like, hey, we were both drinking, we had a good time, we should go out again. And she did. But after he stopped talking to her, it was really bothering her. And she came in and made a report.
By this time, it's too late to conduct a rape kit or drug test on the victim. But police obtain a search warrant for Jeff's apartment.
The first time he's not home, so we go to the manager of the apartment complex.
When the building manager reads the search warrant, she is visibly distressed.
You could see the blood just like go like this, just go right off her face. And we looked at her, she says, he did the same thing to me. We went to search his apartment. Screensaver had CIA on it. He had a bulletproof vest there. He had a doctor's coat with his name on it.
They also find what appear to be classified CIA documents, all of which are later determined to be forgeries.
Mr. Marsalis was very good and very committed to pretending to be a doctor. And he convinced other doctors, other patients, other people in the hospital that he was Dr. Marsalis. He came from tremendous privilege. He was given the opportunity to go to a number of great schools, but by the time we encountered him, he was a nursing school dropout who went around lying about who he was and victimizing women. What we found on his computer was a list that he kept. He called it the Yearly Calendar of Women, and that contained the first names of a number of women he had had sexual intercourse with.
They found a list of about 50 women.
We were shocked to learn that it wasn't 2 people who were raped by Marsalis or 3 or 4, but it was many, many women who were all victimized in the same way.
One of the names on the list is Joanne Bottaro Cooper.
Someone who worked for the assistant district attorney started to ask me if I knew Jeffrey Marsalis. She explained to me why they were calling me and what he was being investigated for. And at that moment, I had a flood of emotions. Everything that didn't make sense to me back in March of '04 came at me hard. I hung up the phone and I ran into the bathroom and I had an emotional breakdown.
Jeffrey Marsalis is arrested in April 2005, but makes bail and flees to his mother's condo in Utah. Jessica, Joanne, and a group of other victims work with police to prepare for trial.
We came up with a plan between the Philadelphia police detectives and FBI agents. Some of the victims were local, some were in the surrounding counties, some were in other states. And we started to slowly interview all of those individuals.
It becomes evident that none of the witnesses reported the rapes to police in a timely enough manner to conduct drug tests or a rape kit.
The investigation never identified the actual drug that he used. I think the strength of this case was the volume of victims who did not know one another, but yet their stories all were very similar.
The prosecutor chooses the 3 cases he will present at the trial.
I was a witness. They called me the glue that brought everything together. Because he was doing all of this while we were together, I was the baseline, the patient zero. He started with me and then just continued with these other women. We're all professional, successful women, just confident. And his mother is a strong woman, an educated woman, a confident woman, a successful woman. And it always struck me as bizarre that he chose his victims almost in the image of his mother.
The victims were very brave for being willing to share their story with the jury. Marsalis's defense attorney told the jury that the victims were lying and that this was all some kind of misunderstanding and that Marsalis was the real victim. Marsalis looked very smug and confident.
Their strategy was, he's a liar, he's not a doctor, he's not the things that he said he was, but he's not a rapist. These were women who were looking for, Prince Charming, and he's not that, so they're upset and they conspired together because they had seen him again and then they had a consensual relationship that presented a challenge to get a successful prosecution.
In a controversial ABC interview with Marsalis, he reacts to their accusations of him lying about his profession.
The truth is simple. We had a great time. Had consensual sex numerous times with one another. If I'm such a god-awful person, why do you keep on hanging out with me for?
He's extremely excited by it, but he's excited by it because he is gaining control over somebody who he shouldn't be able to get control over. They shouldn't be easy targets. And so therefore, by going after them, he has gained control, and that level of control thrills him, excites him, and just pushes him to do it again and again and again.
At the trial, the defense lawyers adopt a familiar tactic, victim blaming.
What were you wearing? Why did you sleep with him? Why did you sleep with him again? Why did you go out with him again? So it becomes more a focus on the victim's morality, if you will, than it does about the individual, the accused's culpability in the situation. In Pennsylvania at the time, there was no mechanism for there to be psychological testimony as to why rape victims act the way they do in the wake of a sexual assault. And that was problematic because with the jury, the actions that a person takes afterwards are not always what you would expect.
While the jury takes 5 days to deliberate, the victims hold their collective breath.
The result came in, and it was an acquittal.
Let me make something very, very clear to you. I have never drugged anybody. I have never raped anybody. I've never forced myself on anybody, ever.
It was difficult to hear the verdict of not guilty with respect to those 3 women. What Marsalis didn't expect, what caused the smug look on his face to disappear, was when he was arrested in the courtroom for what was going to be a second trial with 7 different women presenting their story to a jury.
After his acquittal and rearrest, Victims continue to come forward, and Jeff becomes the focus of a new investigation. But hidden from the proceedings, just 2 weeks prior to the Philadelphia trial, Jeff is living in Sun Valley, Idaho.
His family had some affiliation with this resort, and he got a job there as a security guard.
It's there in October 2005 that Marsalis and a female coworker share a few drinks after work. When she's suddenly unable to walk, he puts her in a taxi and takes her back to his place to repeat a familiar scenario. But this time, Jeff's tried and true technique backfires.
She was a lesbian, and she knew that she was not going to be sleeping with a man. So she knew that she woke up and it wasn't right.
She was not confused about what happened to her. And so because she went to the police right away, the detectives were able to get a rape kit, to get physical evidence proving what had happened. They were able to talk to the bartender who talked about the drinks that were served. They were able to find witnesses who had seen her being dragged out of a taxi cab by Marsalis. This was exactly the kind of evidence that we did not have in Pennsylvania because the victim came forward right away.
Now, with another trial pending in Idaho, Philadelphia law enforcement take Jeffrey Marsalis to trial for the second time in May 2007. The case focuses on 7 women, bringing a total of 66 charges, including rape.
One of the women lived in his building, and a woman who had met Marsalis on a date after coming into Philadelphia from New Jersey.
That woman is Joanne Butaro Cooper.
I gave my testimony, and I got to stare him straight in the face and point at him and accuse him of the crimes he committed against me. That felt very empowering. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. He saw me there, and his face dropped. It felt really good to know that someone could scare him a little bit still.
After deliberating a week, the jury finds Marsalis guilty on 2 counts of sexual assault and impersonating a government official, but without physical evidence, acquits him of all other charges.
They found him guilty of sexually assaulting 2 women.
I was surprised that the jury did not see the truth and that he wasn't convicted on all counts.
He's a felon now, and he will always have to register as a sex offender.
With Jeff finally behind bars, Jessica begins the difficult task of rebuilding her life.
With every moment that you are moving forward and putting it further in your rear view, I look at my own life, and there are some tough years. It's not something that you ever forget. Certainly, it's always there. It's possible to get to a point that it's not the sole influence in your life.
Despite not being found guilty of rape, Marsalis is given a new moniker in the press, the Match.com rapist. It's not until April 2009 that the Idaho case goes to trial.
The jury heard that Marsalis denied having had any kind of intercourse with the victim, and yet a rape kit that was performed showed that he was a liar.
I felt like she was the strongest. She did what all of us hadn't done.
As Jeff enters the court for sentencing, he notices Jessica sitting in the gallery.
He thought he was being smug and he was getting to me. But at the end of the day, my being able to look back at him and, really just signal to him what a dirtbag he is was satisfying and an opportunity to just take my power back, and I did.
After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Marsalis guilty of rape.
When it comes to sentencing, the judge is able to take the dozens of cases from Pennsylvania into account.
The outcome of the 3rd trial was the most satisfying of all of them.
I will sentence you to a term of life imprisonment in the Idaho State Penitentiary.
Jeffrey Marsalis is declared a sexually violent predator.
It was the moment in which I knew that it wasn't wrong. I knew that it was not real. And I'm glad I went to Idaho, because I don't know whether I'd have gotten that closure otherwise.
I questioned myself instead of him, and I will never do that again. And I will make sure that I can speak out and tell women that you should always believe yourself first.
Joanne starts a rape crisis counseling organization and eventually, through a mutual friend, reconnects with an old boyfriend from college.
I've been married for 3.5 years. I'm extremely happy in my job. I work for a nonprofit, and I just continue to do things that make me happy.
Without the bravery of all the survivors in this case, he'd still be out there doing it.
Jeffrey Marsalis is, in fact, one of the worst serial rapists in Pennsylvania's history.
After the Marsalis case, rape trials in Pennsylvania will never be the same.
When victim after victim shared the same story, and Marsalis was still acquitted of rape, the Pennsylvania legislature responded by changing the law, which allowed expert testimony to come into rape cases so that jurors could better understand the psychology and behavior of rape victims.
I want to let others know that this is not going to define you for the rest of your lives. This is a moment in time, and it sucks. Like, it really, truly sucks, but you get past it.
Jessica goes on to become an intelligence officer in the Navy and spends 20 years working for the FBI.
I'm an investigator at Microsoft now. There are so many good things that have gone on in my life. I'm married. I have 2 amazing, silly dogs.
The night in Los Angeles doesn't fall all at once. It seeps in slowly, like ink bleeding through paper. Neon signs flicker awake one by one, their colors staining the asphalt in soft reds and electric blues. The hum of traffic softens into something distant, something almost forgettable. Windows close. Curtains are drawn. Doors are locked, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times. But on certain nights in the mid-1980s, none of that was enough. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists when a city is afraid. It is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of tension. A held breath stretched across miles of streets, across thousands of homes where people lay awake in the dark, listening. Not to anything specific. Just listening. Waiting. Somewhere in that darkness, someone is moving. He doesn't hurry. He never does. There's a patience to him, a quiet confidence that settles into each step. The neighborhoods blur together. Suburban houses with trimmed lawns, aging apartment blocks with flickering hallway lights, quiet streets where nothing is supposed to happen. He studies them the way a hunter studies a forest, not looking for anything obvious, but for the smallest crack. A window left slightly ajar. A door that doesn't quite latch. A light that turns off just a little too late. He doesn't choose victims. He chooses opportunities. Inside one of those homes, a woman shifts in her sleep. The night air is warm, pressing gently against the walls. There is nothing remarkable about this house. Nothing that would make it stand out among the thousands scattered across Southern California. A framed photograph rests on a bedside table. A glass of water half full. A pair of shoes placed neatly by the door. The quiet details of an ordinary life. And then, without warning, that life is no longer ordinary. A shadow crosses the threshold. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The darkness welcomes it in, folds around it, hides it. There is a moment, a single, fragile moment, where everything still exists as it should, where the night is just a night, and the silence is just silence. Then something shifts. A floorboard creaks. Soft. Almost apologetic. The woman's eyes open. At first, there is confusion. That hazy space between sleep and waking where the mind struggles to make sense of shapes in the dark. The human brain is wired to rationalize, to soften fear before it takes form. It tells her it's nothing. The house settling. A dream clinging too tightly. But then she sees him. Not clearly. Not all at once. Just enough. A figure standing where no one should be standing. The air changes. It thickens. Fear doesn't arrive gradually, it detonates. Her heart slams against her ribs. Her breath catches somewhere deep in her chest. She tries to move, to speak, to do anything that might pull her out of this moment, but her body betrays her. For a fraction of a second, She is frozen in place, caught between instinct and disbelief. He steps closer. There is no rush in him, no panic, only control. And in that control, there is something far more terrifying than rage. Because rage is chaotic. Rage can be predicted, sometimes even avoided. But this is something else. This is deliberate, measured, a presence that doesn't need to shout or threaten because it already knows how this will end. The city will wake up the next morning to sunlight that feels almost offensive in its normalcy. News will travel quickly, but never quickly enough. Another home, another victim, another story that will be told in fragments, police reports, hushed conversations, headlines that try to make sense of something that refuses to be understood. People will ask the same questions they've asked before. How did he get in? Why this house? Why her? There will be no satisfying answers. Because the truth is far more unsettling. There is no pattern you can rely on, no warning you can trust, no rule that guarantees safety. And somewhere, as the city scrambles to process what has happened, he will already be gone, moving through the daylight like anyone else, invisible in a crowd. Just another face passing by, unnoticed, unremembered. The kind of person you might stand next to in a store without ever thinking twice. The kind of person who leaves no trace behind except for what he chooses to take. And what he leaves behind is fear. It spreads faster than any official report. It seeps into conversations at dinner tables, into whispered phone calls between friends, into the quiet rituals people begin to adopt without even realizing it. Locks are checked again and again. Windows are sealed tight despite the heat. Lights are left on through the night, as if brightness alone could keep the darkness out. But fear has a way of slipping through even the smallest cracks. The media gives him a name that feels almost cinematic, almost unreal in its simplicity. The Night Stalker. It sticks because it fits. Because there is something about the idea of a predator who belongs to the night that resonates on a deeper level, something primal and ancient. Long before cities and streetlights, humans feared what moved in the darkness beyond their fires. Now, that darkness has followed them home. And it is not outside anymore. It is inside. The attacks do not stop. If anything, they become more brazen. The distance between them shrinks, the brutality sharpens. Each crime scene tells a story, but not one that offers clarity. There are pieces, fragments, hints of something ritualistic, something deeply personal, and yet completely detached at the same time. Investigators begin to see the threads connecting the chaos, but those threads lead them into something far more complicated than they expected. This is not a man driven by simple motives. There is no single trigger, no clean narrative that can be followed from beginning to end. There is only escalation. And with each new crime, the city sinks deeper into a kind of collective dread that is impossible to shake. Parents begin sleeping in shifts, one awake while the other rests. Gun stores see lines stretching out the door. Dogs bark at shadows that may or may not be there. Every unfamiliar noise becomes a potential warning. Every stranger becomes a possibility. Because the most terrifying part of all is this. He could be anywhere. He could be watching. He could be waiting. And when he chooses to act, it will not matter who you are or what you've done. It will not matter how careful you've been or how many precautions you've taken. All it takes is one moment, one unlocked door, one open window, one breath taken at the wrong time, and the night will let him in. This is not just the story of a killer. It is the story of a city that learned, night after night, that safety can be an illusion. That evil does not always announce itself with chaos and noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, patiently, almost gently, until it isn't. And by the time you realize what you're facing, it's already too late. Before the fear had a name, before headlines carved his existence into something the public could grasp, there was a boy growing up under a relentless sun in El Paso, a place where the horizon stretches wide and unforgiving, and where heat seeps into everything, even memory. The neighborhoods are modest, dust settling on windowsills and clinging to shoes, the kind of place where people knew each other just well enough to wave, but not well enough to truly see what was happening behind closed doors. It was here that Richard Ramirez began, long before he would become something the world would fear, long before the darkness inside him found its way into the homes of strangers. As a child, there was nothing outwardly extraordinary about him, nothing that would make a passerby stop and look twice, but the environment around him was already shaping something volatile, something fragile in all the wrong ways. The house he grew up in was not a sanctuary. It was a place where tension lived in the walls, where anger could ignite without warning, where violence was not an anomaly but a pattern. His father was known to be strict, sometimes explosively so, and discipline often crossed the line into something harsher, something that left marks not always visible to the eye. In homes like that, children learn quickly how to read the air, how to anticipate moods, how to shrink themselves to avoid becoming the center of someone else's storm. But shrinking does not erase what is absorbed. It only buries it deeper. Outside, the world offered little refuge. The streets of El Paso in the 1960s and 70s carried their own roughness, their own quiet lessons about survival. It was a place balanced on the edge of cultures, of influences, of histories that collided and coexisted, and within that environment, young minds could be shaped in unpredictable ways. For Richard, one of the most defining influences came in the form of a man who seemed, at first, larger than life. His cousin, a veteran who had returned from the war in Vietnam, brought with him stories that did not belong in the ears of a child. They were not stories softened by time or filtered through reflection. They were raw, graphic, filled with details that most people would spend a lifetime trying to forget. He spoke of violence not as something tragic, but as something almost routine, almost normal. There were photographs, too, images that captured moments of brutality in a way that words alone could not. For a young boy already living in an environment where violence existed at home, these stories did not feel entirely foreign. Instead, they blurred the line between what was real and what was acceptable. When violence becomes familiar, it loses its shock. When it is repeated often enough, it begins to feel like part of the natural order of things. The human mind, especially a developing one, adapts in ways that can be deeply unsettling. Curiosity can twist into fascination. Fear can dull into indifference. And in some cases, something even darker can take root. As Richard grew older, the boundaries that typically guide behavior began to erode. School offered little structure or stability for him. There was no clear path, no sense of direction, only a gradual drifting further away from anything that might have anchored him. He began experimenting with drugs at a young age, substances that altered perception and lowered whatever inhibitions remained. Cocaine, in particular, would become a recurring presence, fueling impulsivity, distorting judgment, and amplifying the darker aspects of his psyche. But drugs alone do not create what he would become. They are accelerants, not origins. The deeper currents ran beneath the surface, shaped by years of exposure to violence, neglect, and a growing detachment from empathy. There were signs, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. Petty crimes, small acts of theft, behaviors that hinted at a disregard for rules and consequences. These are often dismissed as phases, as mistakes of youth, but in retrospect, they can form a pattern, a trajectory that leads somewhere far more dangerous. By the time he reached adolescence, there was already a noticeable shift in how he interacted with the world. There was a coldness, an emotional distance that made it difficult for others to connect with him in any meaningful way. Relationships were shallow, fleeting. Trust was not something he offered, nor something he seemed to seek. Instead, he moved through life with a kind of detachment that allowed him to observe without engaging, to exist without truly belonging. The influences that surrounded him continued to reinforce this isolation. Exposure to violent imagery, both real and fictional, began to intertwine with his own developing fantasies. There was an emerging fixation on control, on power, on the ability to dominate situations and people. These were not thoughts that surfaced overnight. They evolved slowly, shaped by experience, by environment, by a lack of intervention at critical moments. It is often tempting to look back and search for a single turning point, a moment where everything could have been different, but the reality is rarely that simple. Human behavior is the result of countless variables interacting over time. In Richard's case, there was no single event that defined him. Instead, there was a convergence of factors that, together, created something deeply unstable. As he moved into early adulthood, the distance between him and conventional life widened further. Jobs were inconsistent, responsibilities neglected. He drifted from place to place, eventually making his way to Los Angeles, a city that, on the surface, represented opportunity, reinvention, the promise of something new. But for someone like him, it offered something else entirely. Los Angeles in the 1980s was a city of contrasts, of extremes. Wealth and poverty existed side by side, often separated by nothing more than a few streets. It was vast, sprawling, difficult to fully grasp or control. For someone looking to disappear, to blend into the background, it was the perfect environment. Here, anonymity was not just possible, it was expected. Millions of people moved through the city every day, each carrying their own stories, their own concerns. It was easy to become just another face, another presence that no one questioned. For Richard, this anonymity provided freedom. The lack of structure, the absence of close relationships, the distance from any form of accountability, all of it combined to create a space where his darker impulses could grow unchecked. He spent nights wandering, observing, learning the rhythms of the city. Which neighborhoods quieted down earliest? Which streets were poorly lit? Which homes appeared vulnerable? These were not yet the actions of someone committing the crimes he would later be known for, but they were preparations, whether conscious or not. The mind rehearses before the body acts. It tests scenarios, imagines outcomes, builds a framework that can later be executed. And within that framework, his sense of morality continued to erode. There was also the influence of ideology, or at least a distorted version of it. His growing interest in satanic imagery and symbolism was less about structured belief and more about identity, about adopting something that reinforced his separation from societal norms. It provided a language, a set of symbols that aligned with the chaos he felt internally. It allowed him to externalize something that had been building for years, to give it form, even if that form was rooted in misunderstanding and exaggeration. To the outside world, these elements would later add a layer of fear, a sense that his actions were driven by something beyond human comprehension. But at its core, it was far more human, and perhaps that is what makes it even more unsettling. By the time the first crimes began to surface, the groundwork had already been laid. Years of exposure, neglect, substance abuse, and psychological distortion had converged into something that no longer resembled the boy from El Paso. The transition was not abrupt. It was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. But once it crossed a certain threshold, there was no reversing it. The city he now lived in would become the stage for what followed, a place where his actions would ripple outward, affecting lives in ways that could never be undone. And as the nights in Los Angeles grew heavier, as the silence between sirens stretched longer, the story that began in a small, sun-scorched town in Texas was about to unfold into something far darker, something that would leave an imprint not just on a city, but on the collective memory of everyone who had come to know his name. The stories of victims are often reduced to fragments, to brief mentions that exist only in relation to the person who harmed them. Names become footnotes in a narrative dominated by violence, lives compressed into timelines that begin and end with a single night. But before fear entered their homes, before headlines carried echoes of what happened to them, they were people with routines, with habits so ordinary they felt invisible, with futures that stretched forward in quiet, unremarkable ways. To understand the weight of what was taken, you have to step into those lives before they were interrupted, to see the world as it was when it still felt safe. In the neighborhoods scattered across Los Angeles, life moved with a rhythm that was familiar to anyone who had ever settled into a place and called it home. Mornings began with the soft clatter of dishes, the low murmur of radios tuned to news or music, the ritual of coffee poured into cups that had been used 1,000 times before. There were people who woke early, stepping outside to water plants or collect the newspaper, exchanging brief greetings with neighbors who passed by with the same predictable timing each day. There were children getting ready for school, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, their thoughts fixed on tests, friends, small concerns that felt large in the way only childhood can make them feel. These were the details that made up their world, the quiet structure of lives that felt stable, even if imperfect. Among them were individuals who had built routines over decades, whose homes were filled with objects that carried memories, each one tied to a moment, a person, a story. Elderly couples who had spent years side by side, their conversations shaped by shared history, their movements synchronized in ways that no longer required thought. A glance was enough to communicate what words once did. Their houses were not just places to live, but extensions of who they were, filled with photographs, worn furniture, the subtle signs of time passing gently rather than abruptly. There were also those who lived alone, finding comfort in solitude, creating their own rhythms that did not depend on anyone else. For some, that solitude was peaceful, a space where they could think, reflect, exist without interruption. For others, it carried a quiet undercurrent of vulnerability, a reality that was acknowledged but rarely dwelled upon. Lock the doors, close the windows, trust that the world outside would remain at a distance. That was usually enough. Families existed within these neighborhoods too, their lives intertwined in ways that created both chaos and comfort. Parents balancing responsibilities, children moving through stages of growth that seemed to happen too quickly, and yet not quickly enough. Dinner tables where conversations overlapped, where laughter mixed with frustration, where the small conflicts of daily life played out and then faded. These were the moments that defined their lives far more than anything extraordinary ever could. And then there were the individuals whose paths had only recently begun to take shape, young people stepping into adulthood with a mix of uncertainty and possibility. Jobs that were not quite careers yet, relationships still finding their footing, plans that shifted as reality introduced its complexities. They lived with the sense that there was time ahead, that whatever challenges existed could be navigated, adjusted, overcome. The future was not fixed, but it was there. It existed as something they could move toward. What connected all of these people was not similarity in age, background, or circumstance. It was the assumption of safety, the belief that their homes were boundaries that could not easily be crossed. A door, once locked, represented a line between the outside world and the space they controlled. Windows were openings for light and air, not entry points for danger. This belief was not naive. It was built on years, sometimes decades, of experience that reinforced the idea that certain rules held true. That if you followed them, if you took reasonable precautions, you would be okay. In many ways, this belief is necessary. Without it, the simple act of living would become unbearable. Every sound would carry suspicion, every shadow would demand scrutiny. But belief does not always align with reality, and sometimes the very things that make life feel stable are the same things that make it fragile. On the nights when everything changed, there was no warning that felt different from any other night. The air did not shift in a way that could be recognized in advance. The streets did not signal what was coming. People went through their routines as they always did, preparing for sleep, checking locks, turning off lights. Some may have hesitated for a moment longer than usual, perhaps influenced by the distant awareness that something unsettling had been happening in other parts of the city. News reports, conversations overheard, a vague sense that there was something out there that had not yet been fully understood. But distance creates a kind of false security. What happens to others feels removed, contained, unlikely to cross into your own life. That is how the mind protects itself. Inside their homes, the victims existed in moments that would later be reconstructed through investigation, through evidence, through the fragments left behind. A book left open on a bedside table, marking a page that would never be turned. A television still warm from hours of use, its screen now dark. A glass of water placed within reach, untouched after a certain point in time. These details become significant only in hindsight, transformed from ordinary objects into markers of absence. They tell a story without words, a narrative that unfolds in the spaces between what was and what is no longer. For some, the final hours before everything changed were spent in the company of loved ones, conversations that seemed routine at the time but would later be remembered with painful clarity. The last words spoken, the last expressions shared, the small gestures that carried meaning only after they could no longer be repeated. For others, those hours were spent alone, their thoughts known only to themselves, their routines uninterrupted until the moment they were. There is something deeply human about these moments, something that underscores the reality that none of them were defined by what would happen to them. They were defined by the lives they lived before that point, by the relationships they built, by the experiences that shaped them. The tragedy is not just in the violence that occurred, but in the abruptness with which those lives were altered, the way entire histories were reduced to single events. In the aftermath, families and friends are left to reconcile the person they knew with the circumstances of their loss. Memories become both comfort and burden, reminders of what existed alongside the knowledge that it can no longer be experienced in the same way. The process of understanding is complicated by the randomness of it all. There is no clear reason why one person was targeted over another, no logic that can be followed to reach a satisfying conclusion. This randomness is what makes it so difficult to process, what makes it linger in the minds of those who try to make sense of it. Because if there is no pattern, no reason, then the possibility exists that it could have been anyone. And that thought does not fade easily. As the story unfolds, as the details of the crimes begin to surface, it is important to remember that each victim represents a life that existed fully before it was intersected by violence. They were not just names in reports or faces in photographs. They were individuals who moved through the world with purpose, with connections, with moments that mattered to them and to the people around them. Their stories deserve to be told with that understanding, with the recognition that what was taken cannot be measured solely by what happened in a single night. It must be understood in the context of everything that came before, everything that made them who they were, everything that gave their lives meaning beyond the way they ended. And in holding on to those details, in refusing to let them be overshadowed entirely by the figure who brought harm into their lives, there is a form of resistance, a way of ensuring that they are remembered not just for the tragedy they endured, but for the lives they lived. The night does not announce what it is about to become. It rarely does. In Los Angeles, darkness settles like it always has, folding itself over rooftops, slipping between narrow streets, pressing gently against windows that reflect nothing but black glass. There is no signal, no warning threaded through the air, nothing that would make a person pause before turning off the light and closing their eyes. It begins in the most ordinary way possible, and that is what makes what follows so difficult to comprehend. Because when something horrific grows out of something ordinary, it feels as though reality itself has betrayed you. Inside a modest home, the rhythm of life has already slowed. The television has been turned off, leaving behind a faint warmth in the room. A clock ticks steadily, marking time with mechanical indifference. Somewhere in the house, a faucet drips at uneven intervals, a small imperfection in an otherwise quiet environment. The person inside has gone through their routine without deviation. Doors checked, windows closed, lights turned off one by one until only darkness remains. There is comfort in repetition, in the predictability of small actions that signal the end of a day. Nothing about this night feels different. And yet outside, something is already in motion. He moves without hesitation, but not without awareness. Each step is deliberate, guided by observation rather than impulse. The houses on the street sit quietly, their occupants unaware that they are being evaluated, reduced to variables in a silent calculation. He does not rush because he does not need to. Time, in this moment, belongs entirely to him. He studies the structure, the angles, the points of entry. A window that does not sit flush against its frame. A door that might give under pressure. These are not dramatic weaknesses. They are subtle, almost invisible, unless you are looking for them. And he always is. When he finds what he needs, there is no pause, no internal conflict that might interrupt what is about to happen. The boundary between outside and inside, something most people trust without question, is crossed with a simplicity that feels almost unreal. A slight movement, a quiet shift, and just like that, he is no longer outside. The air inside the home is different. Still. Personal. It carries the scent of the people who live there, the faint traces of their daily lives. This is not his space, and yet he moves through it as though it is. There is a familiarity in his actions, not because he knows this house, but because he understands houses like this. He understands the layout of ordinary life, the predictable placement of rooms, the way people organize their environments without realizing how consistent those patterns can be. The bedroom is where he is heading. It almost always is. There is something about vulnerability that is heightened in sleep, something about the way the body rests, unaware, unguarded. It is not just physical vulnerability. It is psychological. A person in sleep exists in a state where control is temporarily surrendered, where the mind drifts into places disconnected from immediate reality. To interrupt that state is to create a shock so profound that it fractures the sense of safety in a way that is difficult to repair. When he enters the room, the darkness shifts slightly, accommodating his presence. For a moment, nothing happens. The person in the bed continues to breathe steadily, unaware that the space has changed, that the rules no longer apply in the way they did just seconds before. This moment, brief as it is, holds a kind of unbearable tension. It is the last moment where everything still exists as it should. Then it breaks. The sound that wakes them is small. It could be dismissed under different circumstances. But the human brain is sensitive to changes in environment, especially during sleep. Something registers, something pulls them out of that vulnerable state and into awareness. Eyes open, adjusting slowly to the darkness, searching for context. And then they see him. Not clearly, not all at once, but enough to understand that something is wrong in a way that cannot be corrected. Fear does not arrive gently. It is immediate, overwhelming, a surge of adrenaline that floods the body before the mind has time to process what is happening. The instinct to survive activates in an instant, but instinct alone is not always enough. The situation has already been controlled, shaped by someone who entered with intention, who anticipated this moment long before it occurred. There is a confrontation, but it is not equal. It cannot be. The balance of power has been decided before the first word is spoken, before the first movement is made. The victim reacts in the only ways available to them, trying to create distance, to find an escape, to turn an impossible situation into something survivable. Every action is driven by the need to regain control, even if only for a second. But control is not something easily reclaimed once it has been taken. What unfolds in that room is chaotic, but it is a chaos that exists within the framework he has created. The violence is not random in its execution, even if it appears that way from the outside. It is directed, intentional, carried out with a focus that is deeply unsettling. There is no hesitation, no indication that this is anything other than what he came there to do. The victim's world, once defined by routines and familiar spaces, collapses into a series of moments that feel disconnected, fragmented. Time behaves differently under extreme stress. Seconds stretch, details sharpen in ways that seem almost unnatural. The texture of the floor, the shape of shadows on the wall, the sound of breathing that no longer feels like their own. These are the things that remain, the sensory fragments that the mind clings to even as everything else becomes unstable. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ends. Not because it has resolved in any meaningful way, but because he decides it is over. That is the most difficult part to grasp, the idea that the conclusion of such an event is determined entirely by the person who initiated it. There is no negotiation, no mutual agreement that the moment should end. It ends because he allows it to. He leaves the way he entered, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. The house returns to stillness, but it is no longer the same stillness. It is heavier now, filled with something that cannot be seen but is impossible to ignore. The objects in the room remain where they were, but their meaning has shifted. The bed is no longer just a place of rest. The doorway is no longer just an entry point. Everything has been altered in a way that cannot be undone. Outside, the night continues as if nothing has happened. Cars pass in the distance. A dog barks somewhere down the street. The world does not pause to acknowledge what has occurred within the walls of that house. It moves forward, indifferent, leaving behind a space where something irreversible has taken place. By morning, the reality of the situation begins to surface. What was once contained within the darkness becomes visible, undeniable. The details emerge slowly, each one adding to a picture that is difficult to fully comprehend. And yet, this is only one incident among many. The pattern is still forming, still being understood. Each event adds another layer, another piece of information that both clarifies and complicates the overall picture. Because the more that is revealed, the more it becomes clear that this is not isolated, not contained. It is part of something larger, something that is moving through the city with a consistency that defies simple explanation. The fear that begins to spread is not just based on what has happened, but on what might happen next. Because if it can happen here, in this house, on this street, then it can happen anywhere. And that realization changes everything. Morning arrives with a kind of indifference that feels almost cruel. In Los Angeles, sunlight spills across rooftops, warming sidewalks, slipping through blinds and curtains as if nothing has changed. But inside the house, the air is different. It carries a weight that does not belong to daylight, a heaviness that lingers in corners, in hallways, in the quiet spaces between objects that now feel unfamiliar. The discovery rarely happens all at once. It unfolds in stages, in moments that begin with confusion and end with something far more difficult to name. Sometimes it is a family member returning home, expecting routine and finding disruption. A door left slightly ajar when it should have been locked. A light that was supposed to be off, but isn't. These are small things, easily dismissed in another context, but here they create a subtle sense that something is wrong. The mind resists that conclusion at first. It searches for alternatives, for explanations that fit within the boundaries of normal life. Maybe someone forgot. Maybe there is a simple reason. But as they step further inside, the illusion begins to break. The silence is too complete, too absolute. Houses have their own language, their own collection of sounds that signal life. The hum of appliances, the creak of settling wood, the distant movement of someone in another room. When those sounds are absent, the quiet becomes something else entirely. It becomes a presence. And then comes the moment that cannot be undone, the instant when uncertainty is replaced by realization. It might be the sight of something out of place, an object that has been moved in a way that makes no sense. A drawer left open, its contents disturbed. A chair slightly shifted from its usual position. These are the first visible signs that the boundary of the home has been violated, that someone has been here who does not belong. Panic begins to rise, not yet fully formed, but enough to quicken the pulse, to sharpen the edges of perception. Every detail becomes amplified, every inconsistency impossible to ignore. And then the discovery reaches its most devastating point. There is no gradual transition into understanding, no gentle way to process what is seen. It arrives all at once, overwhelming, final. The human mind struggles in these moments, trying to reconcile what it is seeing with what it knows to be possible. There is a brief, fragile space where denial attempts to hold on, where reality feels negotiable. But that space collapses quickly. What remains is something raw, something that cannot be softened or explained away. Emergency calls are made with voices that tremble, words that come out fragmented, incomplete. The language of crisis is never smooth. It is broken, urgent, driven by the need to communicate something that feels almost impossible to describe. Within minutes, the outside world begins to intrude. Police arrive first, their presence immediate and procedural. They step into the space not as residents, but as observers, trained to see what others cannot, to interpret details that might otherwise go unnoticed. The shift in perspective is stark. Where others see chaos, they begin to identify structure. Where others see only loss, they begin to look for information. The house transforms into something else entirely. It is no longer just a home. It becomes a scene. Every object, every surface, every inch of space is now part of a larger puzzle. Officers move carefully, deliberately, aware that even the smallest disturbance could alter the integrity of what they are trying to understand. The initial walkthrough is both methodical and intuitive, guided by training but also by experience. They look for signs of forced entry, for indications of how someone might have moved through the space. A window that has been tampered with, A door that shows subtle marks of pressure. These are the entry points, the places where the outside world breached the safety of the inside. They are small, often overlooked details, but they carry significant weight. They tell the first part of the story, the moment when the boundary was crossed. Inside, the evidence begins to reveal itself in layers. There are obvious signs, things that immediately draw attention, but there are also quieter details that require patience to uncover. Fingerprints left on surfaces, some partial, some smudged, each one a potential connection to the person responsible. Footprints that track movement, patterns that show where someone walked, where they paused, where they turned. These are not random marks. They are traces of behavior, physical representations of decisions made in real time. Investigators photograph everything, documenting the scene from multiple angles, preserving it in a way that allows it to be revisited long after it has been cleared. The camera becomes a tool of memory, capturing details that might otherwise fade or be overlooked. Measurements are taken, distances calculated, positions recorded with precision. This is the language of investigation, a way of translating a chaotic event into something that can be analyzed, understood, and eventually explained. There are also items missing, things taken from the house that create gaps in the narrative. Jewelry, money, personal belongings that have been removed without permission. These are not just acts of theft. They are part of the pattern, elements that may connect one incident to another. Each missing item becomes a question, a point of inquiry that extends beyond this single location. The presence of certain symbols begins to emerge as well, marks that do not belong to the ordinary structure of the home. They are intentional, placed with purpose, meant to convey something even if that meaning is not immediately clear. To the investigators, they are both a clue and a complication. They suggest a level of deliberation, an identity that extends beyond simple criminal behavior. They hint at a mindset that is more complex, more layered, and therefore more difficult to predict. As more scenes are processed across the city, similarities begin to surface. Patterns that were not visible in isolation start to take shape when viewed collectively. The same methods of entry, the same types of evidence, the same unsettling details that repeat with slight variations. This is the point where individual incidents begin to merge into something larger. The realization that these are not separate events, but connected ones, shifts the entire approach to the investigation. It introduces a new level of urgency, a recognition that the person responsible is not only active, but consistent. The media begins to take notice as well, their presence adding another layer to the unfolding situation. Information starts to move beyond police reports and into public awareness. Details are shared, sometimes accurately, sometimes not, but always with an impact. The public begins to piece together their own understanding of what is happening, often filling in gaps with speculation. This can be both helpful and harmful, generating leads while also creating confusion. Back at the scenes, the work continues with a focus that borders on obsession. Investigators revisit details, re-examine evidence, question assumptions. They know that the answers they are looking for are here, embedded in the physical reality of what has been left behind. But finding those answers requires time, patience, and a willingness to look beyond the obvious. There are moments of frustration, of uncertainty, where the pieces do not seem to fit together in a way that makes sense. But there are also moments of clarity, small breakthroughs that provide direction, that suggest a path forward. Each scene adds to the collective understanding, each detail contributing to a profile that is slowly, carefully being constructed. And yet, even as that understanding grows, there is an underlying awareness that time is not on their side. Because while they are analyzing what has already happened, the person responsible is still out there, still moving, still capable of creating new scenes that will need to be processed in the same painstaking way. The cycle threatens to repeat itself, to expand beyond what can be contained. And that is the tension that defines this stage of the story. The balance between discovery and prevention, between understanding the past and stopping the future. The evidence speaks, but it does not speak quickly enough. And until it does, the city remains suspended in a state of uncertainty, waiting for something that has not yet been fully revealed. By the time investigators begin to speak about a single offender with any real confidence, the city has already started to fracture under the pressure of not knowing. In Los Angeles, fear doesn't just sit in the background anymore. It becomes part of daily decision-making, shaping how people move, how they think, how they sleep. For the detectives assigned to the case, this shift is impossible to ignore. Every new report, every call that comes in, carries the possibility that it is connected, that it belongs to the same pattern they are trying to define. But patterns, especially in cases like this, are rarely clean. They resist simplicity. They bend and twist, creating just enough consistency to suggest a single source, but enough variation to keep certainty just out of reach. The early days of the investigation are filled with names, faces, and fragments of information that do not immediately align. Witness descriptions vary, sometimes dramatically. One person recalls a tall figure, another insists he was shorter. Some describe a face partially hidden, others remember only the eyes, intense, unblinking, impossible to forget, but difficult to fully reconstruct. Memory under stress is unreliable, shaped as much by fear as by reality. Investigators know this, but they also know that within those inconsistencies, there may be threads worth following. They begin to build profiles, not of a single suspect, but of multiple possibilities. Each one is examined, tested against the available evidence, measured against the details that have been collected from the scenes. There are individuals who seem to fit, at least on the surface. Men with criminal histories, men who have committed similar offenses in the past, men whose behavior raises questions that cannot be easily dismissed. These are the first suspects, the ones who draw attention because they already exist within the system. They are brought in for questioning, their movements scrutinized, their alibis tested. Interrogation rooms become spaces where tension hangs thick in the air, where silence can be as revealing as words. Some deny everything, their responses controlled, measured. Others react with anger, with confusion, with a kind of defensiveness that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Detectives watch closely, not just for what is said, but for how it is said. The shift in posture, the hesitation before answering, the moments where eye contact is broken. These are the details that can suggest deception, but they are not proof. And proof is what they need. Again and again, these early suspects are examined and then released, their connection to the crimes weakening under closer inspection. Evidence does not support the initial suspicion, timelines do not align, physical descriptions fail to match in ways that cannot be reconciled. Each time this happens, the investigation resets slightly, forced to adjust its direction, to reconsider its assumptions. It is a process that is both necessary and exhausting. Leads come in from the public as well, fueled by media coverage that continues to expand. Tips flood in, some vague, some specific, all of them requiring attention. People report suspicious neighbors, unfamiliar faces seen in their neighborhoods, encounters that seemed insignificant at the time but now feel important. Each tip is logged, evaluated, followed up on when possible. The volume alone becomes a challenge, a constant stream of information that must be filtered, prioritized, and either pursued or set aside. Within this flood, there are moments that seem promising. A description that matches closely with one provided at a scene. A vehicle spotted near multiple locations. A pattern of movement that suggests intent rather than coincidence. These leads are pursued with intensity, resources directed toward tracking down individuals who fit the emerging profile. Surveillance is conducted, records are checked, connections are mapped out in an attempt to find something solid, something that can move the case forward. But time and again, these leads dissolve under scrutiny. The person in question is accounted for during the times of the attacks. The vehicle belongs to someone with no connection to the crimes. The pattern, once examined more closely, reveals itself to be circumstantial rather than intentional. Each dead end adds weight to the investigation, not just in terms of time lost, but in the psychological toll it takes on those involved. Detectives are trained to handle pressure, to work through complexity, but there is a cumulative effect that cannot be ignored. The knowledge that the offender is still active, still out there, creates a constant sense of urgency that does not fade. It builds with each new incident, with each confirmation that the pattern continues. Internally, there are discussions about the nature of the person they are looking for. Behavioral analysts begin to contribute, offering insights based on the actions observed at the scenes. They speak of control, of escalation, of a personality that does not conform to simple categorization. This is not someone driven solely by impulse, but neither is it someone operating within a rigid, predictable structure. There is a fluidity to the crimes, an adaptability that makes it difficult to anticipate the next move. This complicates the development of a profile, forcing investigators to consider a wider range of possibilities. Is he local to one area, or does he move across the city with ease? Does he have a stable living situation, or is he transient, blending into different environments without leaving a trace? These questions do not have immediate answers, but they shape the direction of the investigation, influencing where resources are allocated and how strategies are developed. At the same time, the media continues to build a narrative that both helps and hinders the process. The name given to the offender, the Night Stalker, takes hold in the public consciousness, creating a figure that feels almost mythological. This has consequences. On one hand, it raises awareness, encouraging people to be vigilant, to report anything unusual. On the other hand, it amplifies fear to a level that can distort perception, leading to an increase in false reports, in misinterpretations of ordinary events. Investigators must navigate this carefully, balancing the need for public assistance with the risk of misinformation. Within the department, coordination becomes increasingly important. The recognition that these crimes are connected across different jurisdictions forces a shift in how information is shared. Departments that might not typically collaborate closely are now required to communicate in real time, to compare notes, to ensure that no detail is overlooked. This is not always seamless. Differences in procedure, in priorities, in communication styles can create friction. But the necessity of the situation overrides these challenges, pushing everyone toward a common goal. Despite these efforts, the central problem remains unchanged. They do not have a definitive suspect. They do not have a name that can be attached with certainty to the crimes. What they have is a collection of behaviors, a series of actions that, when viewed together, form a disturbing but incomplete picture. The frustration lies in how close they feel at times, how certain leads seem to bring them to the edge of a breakthrough, only to fall apart under closer examination. It is a cycle that repeats, each iteration refining their understanding but not yet delivering the resolution they need. Meanwhile, the city continues to live under the shadow of what is happening. Each new incident reinforces the reality that this is not over, that the person responsible is still operating with a level of freedom that feels unacceptable. The pressure on investigators intensifies, not just from within the department, but from the public, from officials, from a growing demand for answers that cannot yet be provided. And within that pressure, the investigation reaches a critical point. The accumulation of evidence, of failed leads, of partial insights, begins to converge toward something that feels different. Not yet a solution, not yet a clear path forward, but a shift in momentum that suggests the possibility of change. It is subtle, easy to overlook if you're not paying close attention, but it is there. A sense that the distance between what is known and what needs to be known is beginning to narrow. And when that distance finally closes, when the pieces align in a way that can no longer be ignored, everything will change. But for now, they remain in the space between, where uncertainty still holds, where the answers are just out of reach, and where the next move, from either side, could determine how the story unfolds. There is a moment in every investigation when chaos begins to organize itself, when fragments that once felt unrelated start to lean toward each other, quietly, almost reluctantly, until they form something that resembles direction. In Los Angeles, that moment does not arrive with clarity or certainty. It emerges slowly, buried beneath weeks of exhaustion, doubt, and the weight of too many unanswered questions. Detectives do not immediately recognize it for what it is. At first, it feels like just another piece of information, another detail to be logged, examined, and potentially discarded. But this time, something holds. Something refuses to dissolve under scrutiny. It begins, as many breakthroughs do, with something small. Not dramatic, not obvious, but persistent. A piece of physical evidence recovered from one of the scenes, something that had been collected early on but had not yet revealed its full significance. A shoe print. At first glance, it is just another mark, another impression left behind in a space already filled with signs of intrusion. But as investigators revisit the evidence, comparing it across multiple scenes, a pattern begins to emerge. The same distinctive sole, the same unusual design, appearing again and again. It is not a coincidence. It cannot be. The realization is subtle but powerful. This is not just evidence of presence. It is evidence of continuity. A single individual moving through different locations, leaving behind the same trace each time. The print is analyzed in detail, its dimensions measured, its characteristics documented with precision. Investigators begin to narrow their focus, shifting from a broad search for possibilities to a more targeted pursuit. They're no longer looking for just anyone. They're looking for someone who wears a very specific type of shoe. This might seem insignificant on the surface, but in an investigation defined by uncertainty, specificity is invaluable. It transforms the search from something abstract into something tangible. At the same time, forensic analysis continues to develop other pieces of evidence that, when combined, begin to form a more cohesive picture. Fingerprints recovered from multiple scenes are compared, their patterns examined for consistency. For a time, these prints exist in isolation, lacking a match within existing databases. But their presence across different locations reinforces what investigators are beginning to understand. This is not a series of unrelated incidents. This is the work of one individual, methodical enough to leave similar traces, but confident enough to continue despite the risk. The turning point accelerates when a critical decision is made, one that shifts the investigation from internal analysis to public engagement. The release of information to the media becomes more strategic, more focused. Instead of broad warnings and general descriptions, specific details are shared, including the nature of the evidence being sought. The public is asked not just to be cautious, but to be observant in a very particular way. This changes the dynamic. It transforms millions of people into potential contributors to the investigation. And in a city as vast as Los Angeles, that kind of reach cannot be underestimated. It does not take long for the impact to be felt. Tips begin to come in that are more aligned with the evidence, more precise in their descriptions. Among them is a report that stands out not because it is dramatic, but because it fits. A shoe, a very specific model, recognized by someone who had seen it before, who had paid attention in a way that most people would not. This information is cross-referenced with known purchases, with retail records, with any data that can narrow down who might own such an item. The process is meticulous, requiring patience and coordination, but it begins to yield results. Names start to surface, individuals who could potentially match not just the physical evidence, but the behavioral profile that has been developing in parallel. One name, in particular, begins to draw attention. It is not immediately definitive, not yet supported by overwhelming proof, but it aligns in ways that cannot be ignored. Richard Ramirez enters the investigation not as a confirmed suspect, but as a possibility that demands closer examination. His background, his movements, his associations, all begin to be scrutinized with a level of detail that had previously been applied to many others, but this time, the pieces seem to fit more naturally. There are connections that, while not conclusive on their own, form a pattern when viewed together. His presence in areas where crimes have occurred, his lack of a stable routine, his history of behavior that suggests a disregard for boundaries. These are not proofs, but they are indicators, and in the context of everything else, they carry weight. As investigators dig deeper, the evidence begins to tighten around him. Fingerprints recovered from the scenes are compared again, this time with a specific focus. When the match is finally made, it does not arrive with celebration. It arrives with a kind of quiet confirmation, a realization that the search has shifted from possibility to reality. The person they've been trying to understand, to anticipate, to stop, is no longer an abstract figure. He has a name, a face, a history that can now be examined in full. The decision to release his image to the public marks a turning point not just in the investigation, but in the story itself. The photograph circulates quickly, appearing in newspapers, on television, in places where people cannot avoid seeing it. The anonymity that once protected him begins to erode, replaced by recognition, by the possibility that anyone, anywhere, could identify him. This changes everything. For the investigators, it is a strategic move, a way to extend their reach beyond what they can physically control. For him, it is a loss of invisibility, a shift that forces him into a new position, one where movement becomes more dangerous, where every public space carries risk. The response is immediate. Sightings are reported, some credible, others less so, but among them are leads that begin to converge on a specific location. The search narrows, focusing on areas where he is believed to have been seen. Patrols are increased, officers briefed with the latest information, prepared to act if the opportunity arises. But the final moment does not come in the way many might expect. It is not a carefully orchestrated arrest, not a controlled operation executed with precision. It is something far more unpredictable, shaped by the very public awareness that investigators have created. On August 31st, 1985, the situation reaches its breaking point. He is recognized, not by police, but by ordinary people who have seen his face, who have internalized the image circulated through the media. In a city that had lived in fear of him, that recognition carries a different kind of energy. It is not passive. It is active, immediate. He is pursued, not by a single individual, but by a group, their actions driven by a mix of fear, anger, and a desire to stop what has been happening for too long. The streets that once allowed him to move unnoticed now work against him. There is nowhere to blend in, nowhere to disappear. The anonymity that once defined his movements is gone, replaced by a visibility that he cannot escape. When police finally arrive, the situation has already shifted. He is no longer in control, no longer the figure moving through the night with quiet confidence. He is contained, held in place by the very people who had once feared him. The transition is stark, almost disorienting. For months, he existed as something intangible, something that could not be easily grasped. Now, he is physically present, real in a way that changes the entire narrative. The breakthrough is complete, but it does not feel like an end. It feels like a shift, a movement from one phase of the story to another. Because while the search for him is over, the process of understanding what he did, of holding him accountable, of confronting the reality of his actions, is only just beginning. The transition from pursuit to prosecution does not bring the relief many expect. In Los Angeles, the arrest closes one chapter, but it opens another that feels just as heavy, just as complex. The fear that once lived in the unknown now takes a different shape, one rooted in confrontation, in the need to face what has been done and to give it a structure that the law can recognize. Courtrooms are not built for emotion, but emotion finds its way in regardless. It settles into the benches, into the quiet exchanges between families, into the way people hold themselves as they wait for proceedings to begin. The man who once moved through the city unseen is now placed at the center of attention, no longer a shadow, but a presence that cannot be ignored. When Richard Ramirez enters the courtroom for the first time, there is no confusion about who he is. His appearance is deliberate, almost performative, as though he understands the weight of the moment and chooses not to soften it. There is no visible remorse in the way he carries himself, no attempt to blend into the process or diminish his role within it. Instead, there is a kind of defiance, a posture that suggests he is not simply a defendant, but a participant in something larger, something he believes he can still influence. This is not lost on those watching. Families of victims sit only feet away, their presence a quiet counterbalance to his. They do not need to speak for their emotions to be understood. It is there in the way they look at him, in the tension held in their shoulders, in the effort it takes to remain composed in a space where composure feels almost impossible. For them, this is not about spectacle. It is about accountability, about hearing the details that have already changed their lives spoken aloud in a place where they cannot be ignored. The prosecution builds its case methodically, piece by piece, drawing from the extensive investigation that led to this moment. Evidence is presented with precision, each element introduced in a way that connects it to the larger narrative. Fingerprints, forensic analysis, witness testimony, all of it forming a structure that is designed to withstand scrutiny. There is no reliance on a single piece of proof. Instead, the strength of the case lies in how these elements reinforce one another, how they converge on a single conclusion that becomes increasingly difficult to dispute. Witnesses take the stand, their voices carrying the weight of memory, of experiences that cannot be undone. Some speak with clarity, their recollections sharp despite the passage of time. Others struggle, their words interrupted by emotion, by the difficulty of revisiting moments that were never meant to be remembered in such detail. The courtroom listens not just to the facts being presented, but to the human impact behind them. These are not abstract accounts. They are lived experiences, brought into a space where they must be examined, questioned, understood. The defense, as expected, challenges the narrative, testing the evidence, probing for inconsistencies, seeking to create doubt where certainty appears to exist. This is not a reflection of belief, but of process. The legal system requires it, demands that every angle be explored, that every claim be tested. There are arguments about procedure, about the handling of evidence, about the reliability of testimony. These moments slow the pace of the trial, introducing complexity that can feel frustrating to those seeking resolution. But they're part of the structure, part of what ensures that the outcome, whatever it may be, is grounded in more than assumption. Throughout it all, Ramirez maintains a presence that continues to unsettle. There are moments when he appears disengaged, as though the proceedings are happening at a distance. And then there are moments when he leans into the attention, when his behavior becomes more overt, more confrontational. He makes statements that align with the persona that has been constructed around him, references that suggest an identification with something beyond the ordinary framework of the trial. These actions do not alter the evidence, but they influence the atmosphere, adding a layer of tension that is difficult to ignore. The trial extends over months, its duration a reflection of both the complexity of the case and the need for thoroughness. Each day adds to the cumulative weight of what is being presented, building toward a point where a decision must be made. Jurors listen, observe, and absorb information that will ultimately shape their conclusion. They are tasked with something immense, something that goes beyond the simple determination of guilt or innocence. They must interpret, evaluate, and decide within a framework that demands both objectivity and understanding. As the trial approaches its final stages, the focus narrows. Closing arguments bring the narrative into sharper focus, each side presenting its interpretation of the evidence, its version of what the facts mean. The prosecution emphasizes the consistency, the connections that tie each piece of evidence to Ramirez. The defense highlights the areas of uncertainty, the questions that remain, the possibility, however small, that the narrative is not as complete as it appears. It is a moment where language becomes as important as evidence, where the framing of information can influence how it is received. And then comes the waiting. Deliberation is a process that unfolds behind closed doors, removed from public view, but its impact is felt by everyone involved. Time stretches in a way that feels familiar, echoing the earlier stages of the investigation where answers seemed just out of reach. But this time, the uncertainty is contained, limited to a group of individuals whose decision will carry legal weight. When the verdict is finally delivered, it does not arrive with drama. It is spoken clearly, formally, each word carrying significance that cannot be undone.
Guilty.
The term is simple, but its implications are vast. It confirms what the investigation has suggested, what the trial has argued, what the evidence has supported. But it also marks a transition, a movement from process to consequence. The sentencing phase follows, bringing with it a different kind of gravity. This is where the question shifts from what happened to what should be done about it. The crimes, already established, now serve as the basis for determining punishment. The arguments presented here are not about guilt, but about severity, about the appropriate response to actions that have caused irreversible harm. When the sentence is pronounced, death, it is delivered within the framework of the law, a conclusion reached through a process designed to balance justice and procedure. It does not erase what has happened. It does not restore what has been lost. But it provides a form of closure, a recognition that the actions taken have consequences that extend to the highest level of accountability available within the system. For the families, the moment is complex. There is no single emotion that defines it. Relief may exist alongside grief, alongside anger, alongside a sense that no outcome could ever fully address what has been taken from them. The courtroom begins to empty, the formal process concluding, but the impact of what has occurred does not end with the final statement. It continues, carried forward by those who were directly affected, by a city that has lived through the events, by a system that has been tested and, in this case, has delivered a result that aligns with its intended purpose. Ramirez is removed from the public space of the courtroom, his future now defined by the sentence imposed. The figure that once moved through the night, unseen and unpredictable, is now confined, his actions no longer a threat in the same way they once were. But the story does not end with confinement. It lingers in memory in the changes that have been made in the way people think about safety, about vulnerability, about the boundaries that were once taken for granted. Justice, in this context, is not a resolution in the traditional sense. It is a conclusion to a process, one that acknowledges harm and responds to it, but cannot fully undo it. And in that distinction lies the reality of what this moment represents, not an end, but a point from which everything that follows must be understood. Time has a way of softening edges, but it does not erase them. In California, the years that followed the trial did not unfold as a clean return to normalcy. There was no single moment when the city collectively decided it was safe again, no clear boundary between fear and recovery. Instead, there was a gradual shift, subtle and uneven, shaped by memory, by adaptation, by the quiet determination of people who refused to let one chapter define everything that came after. The name Richard Ramirez did not disappear when the courtroom emptied. It lingered, carried in conversations, in news retrospectives, in the way people referenced a time when nights felt different, heavier, less predictable. But over time, that name began to change in meaning. It moved from something immediate and threatening to something historical, a reference point rather than an active presence. This transformation did not diminish what had happened, but it altered how it was held in the collective mind. Memory is not static. It evolves, shaped by distance, by context, by the need to integrate difficult experiences into a broader understanding of the world. For those directly affected, however, time behaves differently. Families of victims do not experience closure in the same way it is often described in narratives. There is no final moment where grief resolves into something manageable. Instead, it becomes part of the fabric of daily life, something that is carried rather than overcome. Anniversaries arrive with quiet weight, dates that once held ordinary significance, now marked by absence. Photographs remain, capturing moments that feel both close and impossibly distant. The lives that were interrupted continue to exist in memory, in stories shared among those who knew them, in the small rituals that keep their presence from fading entirely. These acts of remembrance are not grand or public. They are personal, often private, shaped by individual relationships and the unique ways people process loss. In the broader community, the impact of the case extends beyond memory into behavior. The sense of vulnerability that was exposed during those years did not simply vanish once the threat was removed. It led to changes, both visible and subtle, in how people approach safety. Locks became more than routine, they became deliberate. Security systems, once considered optional, began to feel necessary. Neighborhoods organized, communication increased, awareness sharpened. These changes were not driven by paranoia, but by experience, by the understanding that certain assumptions could no longer be taken for granted. Law enforcement, too, carried forward lessons from the investigation. The coordination required to address a case that crossed jurisdictions highlighted gaps that needed to be addressed. Communication protocols were reevaluated, systems improved, the sharing of information became more structured, more immediate. The case did not exist in isolation within the history of criminal investigation, but it contributed to a growing recognition that the nature of certain crimes required a different approach, one that emphasized collaboration over separation. These institutional changes are often less visible than the events that prompt them, but they shape outcomes in ways that extend far beyond a single case. There is also the question of how such a figure is remembered within the broader cultural landscape. Stories like this have a way of being retold, re-examined, sometimes reshaped to fit different narratives. There is a tension between the need to understand and the risk of inadvertently elevating the person responsible beyond what is appropriate. The focus, when handled with care, remains on the impact, on the lives affected, on the systems that responded. But there is always a pull toward the figure at the center, toward the actions that defy easy explanation. It is a balance that requires intention, a conscious effort to avoid reducing complex human experiences into simplified stories. The psychological aspects of the case continue to draw attention as well. Questions about how someone becomes capable of such actions do not have simple answers, but they remain important. They push researchers, analysts, and the public to look beyond surface-level explanations, to consider the interplay of environment, experience, and individual psychology. This is not about creating excuses or diminishing responsibility. It is about understanding, about identifying patterns that might, in some cases, be recognized earlier, addressed before they escalate into something irreversible. The discomfort in these discussions is part of their value. They challenge assumptions, force a confrontation with aspects of human behavior that are easier to ignore than to examine closely. As the years continue to pass, the physical presence of Ramirez is removed from the equation. His death in 2013, while still incarcerated, closes the final chapter of his direct existence within the system. But even that does not function as an endpoint in the way one might expect. The consequences of his actions do not conclude with his life. They persist, carried forward by those who lived through the events, by the changes that were made in response, by the ongoing conversations about what it all means. Death, in this context, is not resolution. It is simply another point in a timeline that extends beyond any single individual. What remains, ultimately, is not the figure who caused the harm, but the impact of that harm and the ways in which people responded to it. There is resilience in that response, not in a dramatic or easily defined way, but in the steady continuation of life despite what has occurred. People return to routines, rebuild a sense of safety, redefine what normal means in the context of what they have experienced. This process is not uniform. It varies from person to person, from community to community. But it happens, shaped by a combination of necessity and choice. The story, when viewed in its entirety, is not just about violence or fear. It is about the fragility of assumptions, the complexity of human behavior, and the capacity of individuals and communities to adapt in the face of something that challenges their sense of stability. It is also a reminder of the importance of attention, of awareness, of the small details that often go unnoticed until they become significant. The lessons drawn from such events are not always clear or easily articulated, but they exist in the changes that follow, in the questions that continue to be asked. In the end, the night returns to being just a night. Streets fill with the ordinary sounds of life, homes settle into their routines, and the darkness loses some of the weight it once carried. But it is never entirely the same as it was before. There is a layer of understanding that remains, a recognition that safety is something that must be maintained, not assumed. And within that recognition, there is a quiet strength, a willingness to continue forward while still remembering what once disrupted everything. There are stories that end when the final verdict is delivered, and there are stories that continue long after the courtroom has emptied. The case of Richard Ramirez belongs firmly to the second category, not because of what he did after his arrest, but because of what his actions permanently altered in the people who lived through the same time and space he once moved through. In California, the passage of years has softened the immediacy of fear, but it has not erased the awareness that was carved into collective memory during that period. What remains is not panic, but perspective. A quieter, more enduring understanding that safety is not a fixed condition, but something maintained through attention, systems, and human vigilance. The story of his crimes does not survive as a spectacle in the present tense. It survives as a reference point, a moment in history that continues to be examined not for fascination, but for comprehension. The question that lingers is not about him as an individual alone, but about what his actions revealed about vulnerability, about the assumptions people make about their environments, and about how quickly those assumptions can be disrupted. The homes that were once violated exist now in memory and reconstruction, but their significance extends beyond physical space. They represent the fragile boundary between private life and external threat, a boundary that most people assume is stable until it is tested. In the aftermath, that assumption was no longer automatic. It had to be consciously reaffirmed, reinforced through habit and awareness rather than taken for granted. For the families of victims, time did not restore what was lost, but it did create space for memory to take a different shape. Grief, in many cases, shifted from immediate rupture to long-term presence. It became something integrated into life rather than separate from it. The people they lost are no longer defined solely by the circumstances of their deaths. They are remembered through the accumulation of their lives, through stories that are retold, through the quiet persistence of absence that continues to matter even decades later. This form of remembrance is not static. It changes as those who carry it change, adapting to new stages of life, new contexts, new understandings. It is neither resolved nor diminished. It simply continues. Within law enforcement and forensic practice, the case contributed to a broader evolution in how complex, multi-scene investigations are approached. The necessity of coordination across jurisdictions, the importance of early evidence integration, and the role of public engagement in active investigations became more clearly defined in the years that followed. These developments are not always directly attributed to a single case, but cases like this one serve as catalysts, revealing weaknesses in existing systems and prompting structural refinement. The legacy within investigative practice is therefore not about the individual at the center of the crimes, but about the collective response to them and the improvements that emerge from that response. Culturally, the case occupies a complicated space. It is part of a larger category of true crime narratives that continue to attract attention, but its most meaningful impact lies not in its notoriety, but in the way it forces reflection on human behavior and societal preparedness. When examined responsibly, it becomes less about the figure who committed the crimes and more about the conditions that allowed fear to spread so widely and the ways in which communities eventually regained stability. That transition from vulnerability to adaptation is not dramatic. It does not happen in a single moment. It occurs gradually, through repetition, through restored routines, through the quiet rebuilding of trust in everyday life. Even the death of Ramirez in 2013, while still incarcerated, does not function as a definitive conclusion in a symbolic sense. It marks the end of a life, but not the end of the narrative that surrounds it. The consequences of his actions remain embedded in the historical and emotional landscape of those who were affected. His absence does not erase impact, nor does it complete the process of understanding. It simply closes the physical chapter, while leaving interpretation and memory ongoing. In reflecting on this case, what emerges is not a singular explanation or lesson, but a layered understanding of how violence disrupts systems of expectation, how investigations evolve under pressure, and how societies adapt in the aftermath of events that challenge their sense of security. It is also a reminder that the most enduring effects of such cases are not always visible in headlines or legal outcomes. They are found in the quieter adjustments people make, in the awareness that persists long after attention has shifted elsewhere, and in the ways communities continue to define safety not as certainty, but as something actively maintained. In the end, the night returns to being just night again in the places it once felt altered. Streets grow familiar, routines resume, and life continues in its ordinary rhythm. But beneath that normalcy, there is an added layer of understanding, a memory of what once disrupted it, and a collective decision to remain aware without allowing fear to define existence. That balance, fragile and ongoing, is perhaps the most lasting outcome of all. Even after all the testimony, the evidence, the verdicts, and the years that followed, there are still questions that refuse to settle into simple answers. The story of Richard Ramirez does not end cleanly because it was never a story built on clarity to begin with. It is a story that forces anyone who examines it to sit with discomfort, with contradiction, and with the limits of understanding human behavior when it breaks away from what feels recognizable. In California, where much of the history unfolded, the physical spaces remain ordinary. Streets have been rebuilt, homes renovated, entire neighborhoods have changed ownership and appearance. Life continues in a way that looks, on the surface, completely detached from what once happened there. Children play on sidewalks where fear once lingered. Lights come on in windows without hesitation. People sleep without thinking about the shadow of a name that once dominated headlines. But memory does not live in the architecture of a city alone. It lives in people. It lives in the way certain generations remember locking doors twice, in the way parents once checked windows with a level of caution that felt new and unfamiliar. It lives in the shift that occurred when safety stopped being assumed and became something actively maintained. Over time, those behaviors became normalized again, absorbed into routine until they no longer felt like responses to fear, but simply part of life. And yet the origin of that change is not forgotten. It remains present in the background of collective awareness, a reminder of how quickly perception of safety can be disrupted. What makes cases like this difficult to fully contain within narrative is that they resist reduction. There is no single explanation that can account for everything, no single moment that can be identified as the point where things became inevitable. Attempts to understand often move between biography, environment, psychology, and circumstance, but even together they do not form a complete picture. There are always gaps, areas where interpretation reaches its limit and speculation begins. That is part of what makes the story persist. Not because it is unresolved in a legal sense, but because it is unresolved in an emotional and intellectual one. The human mind seeks patterns, seeks coherence, seeks meaning that can be clearly articulated. But some events disrupt those expectations. They leave behind information without offering satisfying conclusions. Within forensic and investigative communities, the case is often referenced not for its notoriety alone, but for the lessons it reinforced about persistence, coordination, and the importance of connecting seemingly isolated incidents. It became an example of how complex behavioral patterns can emerge across multiple locations, how critical it is to share information across jurisdictions, and how evidence that appears insignificant in one context can become crucial when viewed as part of a larger whole. These are structural lessons embedded into practice over time, shaping how future investigations are approached. But beyond systems and procedures, there is also the human element. The investigators who worked the case did not experience it as theory or abstraction. They experienced it as urgency, as exhaustion, as the constant pressure of knowing that while they searched for answers, more events could occur. That psychological weight is part of the reality of such investigations, even if it is less visible in retrospective analysis. For those directly affected by the crimes, the passage of time does not transform meaning, but it does change proximity. What once felt immediate becomes distant in duration, though not necessarily in emotional significance. Life continues as it must, but it continues alongside memory rather than in place of it. The individuals lost are not reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. They are remembered through the full context of their lives, through relationships, through moments that existed independently of the violence that later became associated with their names. This distinction matters because it resists the reduction of identity to a single event. In examining the broader cultural impact, it becomes clear that the case exists in tension between cautionary significance and ethical responsibility. It is often referenced in discussions of criminal behavior, investigative development, and media influence, but it also raises questions about how such stories should be told. There is a balance between understanding and exploitation, between learning from events and transforming them into spectacle. Responsible engagement with this history requires attention to that balance, ensuring that focus remains on impact rather than fascination with the individual at the center of the crimes. Over the decades, public perception has shifted. What once felt immediate and personal to those living through the period has become historical for newer generations. The emotional intensity of lived experience gives way, over time, to contextual understanding. But even historical framing does not remove weight. It simply changes the form in which that weight is carried. The name still exists in records, in studies, in discussions of criminal history, but it is now surrounded by analysis rather than fear. And yet, even as distance increases, there remains a quiet awareness that events like these are not just artifacts of the past. They are reminders of vulnerability, of unpredictability, of the fact that systems of safety are always dependent on human vigilance and adaptation. The death of Ramirez in 2013, while incarcerated, closes the biological timeline, but does not resolve the broader narrative. It marks an endpoint in a legal and physical sense, but not in the sense of interpretation or consequence. What he did continues to exist in the effects it had on individuals, on communities, and on institutional practices. That continuation is what prevents the story from becoming complete in any simple way. Ultimately, what remains is not a singular figure, but a collection of impacts. Changes in procedure, shifts in perception, enduring memories, and ongoing reflections about how such events are understood and discussed. The night, which once carried fear for so many, has returned to ordinary rhythm in most places. But it is no longer entirely the same night it once was. There is an awareness beneath it, quiet but present, that what feels stable is maintained, not guaranteed. And within that awareness lies the most lasting trace of all, not fear, but understanding shaped by what was learned, what was endured, and what was never allowed to be forgotten. If you trace the story far enough back from the headlines, from the courtroom, from the fear that once spread through Los Angeles, what you eventually find is not a single defining moment, but a slow accumulation of conditions, choices, environments, and absences that never announce themselves as important until it is too late to separate them. The life of Richard Ramirez is often spoken about as if it belongs to the language of crime alone, but the deeper reality is that it also belongs to the language of development, of exposure, of environments that shape perception before they ever shape action. Nothing in isolation explains everything, yet everything together forms something that, in hindsight, becomes disturbingly coherent. After years have passed, what remains most difficult is not recounting what happened, but accepting how ordinary so many of the beginnings looked. There is no visible rupture in childhood that clearly announces the future. There is instead a series of environments where boundaries were inconsistent, where violence was not abstract, where influence came not only from family but from fragments of stories and images that were never meant to be internalized without context. These elements do not function as excuses, nor do they simplify responsibility. They simply describe the terrain in which a mind develops, especially one that does not receive the stabilizing forces that guide empathy, restraint, and reflection in a consistent way. As time moves forward, the investigation, the trial, and the aftermath become fixed points in institutional memory. In legal terms, the case is resolved. In procedural terms, it becomes precedent and study material. But in human terms, it continues to exist as something more complicated. It becomes a reference point for how quickly perception of safety can collapse and how slowly that perception rebuilds itself. In the years following the conviction and eventual death in custody in 2013 within California, the figure at the center of the case transitions from immediate threat to historical subject. That transition changes how the story is told, but not what it means to those who lived through it. For survivors, for families, for investigators, the passage of time does not convert memory into abstraction. It only changes its distance. What was once present becomes remembered, but not diminished. In the broader cultural landscape, the case becomes part of a larger discussion about how societies process extreme violence. It sits alongside other cases that challenge assumptions about predictability, motive, and the boundaries of understanding human behavior. Over time, experts in psychology, criminology, and sociology revisit it not to sensationalize it, but to examine its structural elements. They look at patterns of escalation, at environmental influences, at behavioral indicators that, in theory, might be recognized earlier in future cases. But even these analyses reach limits. Human behavior does not always conform to predictive models. There are always deviations, always exceptions, always gaps between theory and reality. What the case ultimately reinforces is not certainty, but humility in the face of complexity. It demonstrates that systems designed to identify and respond to danger are necessary, but never infallible. It shows that collaboration between institutions matters, that information sharing can change outcomes, and that evidence, no matter how small, can become significant when viewed in connection rather than isolation. These lessons have been absorbed into investigative practice, shaping how future cases are approached across jurisdictions. Yet, even with improved systems, the underlying tension remains unchanged. Society continues to rely on the assumption that most environments are safe most of the time, while also maintaining mechanisms to respond when that assumption fails. That balance is fragile, but essential. It is what allows daily life to function without constant paralysis, even in the awareness that absolute security does not exist. For those who study such cases, there is also an ethical dimension that cannot be separated from analysis. The way stories are told matters. The focus placed on the perpetrator versus the impact on victims shapes public understanding. Over time, there has been a gradual shift towards centering the experiences of those affected, rather than the persona of the individual responsible. This shift does not erase the importance of understanding the offender, but it reframes it within a broader context that prioritizes human cost over notoriety. In the physical spaces where events once occurred, life has continued in ways that make no reference to what happened unless one already knows. Homes are rebuilt, streets change, communities evolve. This continuity is part of how societies heal, not by erasing the past, but by refusing to be permanently defined by it. Yet beneath that continuity, there remains an invisible layer of awareness, a kind of collective memory that acknowledges what once disrupted the normal flow of life. It does not dominate daily existence, but it informs it subtly, in ways that are often unspoken. The story, when viewed in its entirety, does not offer a simple conclusion. It does not resolve into a single lesson or a single interpretation. Instead, it remains layered, shifting depending on where attention is placed. If you focus on the individual, it becomes a study of behavior and consequence. If you focus on the investigation, it becomes a story of coordination, persistence, and adaptation. If you focus on the victims and communities, it becomes a story of loss, resilience, and memory. All of these perspectives are valid, and none of them are complete on their own. That incompleteness is not a failure of understanding, but a reflection of reality itself. Not all stories can be reduced without losing essential meaning. Some require holding multiple truths at once, even when they do not fully align. In the end, what remains is not the figure who once moved through the night, nor the fear that once defined a particular moment in time, but the way in which people and systems responded to it. The adjustments made, the awareness gained, the memories preserved, and the ongoing effort to understand without distorting. The night returns to ordinary form, as it always does. But it carries with it the quiet imprint of what was learned during the time when it was not ordinary at all. If there is anything the case leaves behind beyond records, testimony, and institutional memory, it is the uncomfortable awareness that understanding does not always bring closure, and closure does not always feel like resolution. The story of Richard Ramirez does not settle into a neat conclusion because it was never a story that operated within neat boundaries. Even after the legal system reached its verdict, even after his death in 2013 within California closed the physical presence of the individual, what remained continued to circulate in quieter, more persistent forms. It exists in how investigators reflect on the evolution of multi-scene crimes, in how forensic methodologies were refined, in how communication between jurisdictions became more structured and responsive. These are institutional echoes, embedded into systems that now function differently because of what was once revealed under pressure. But there is another layer that does not belong to systems or procedures. It belongs to memory, perception, and the human tendency to reassess safety after it has been disrupted. In Los Angeles, the physical landscape has long moved forward. Streets no longer resemble the versions that existed during the height of fear. Buildings change ownership, neighborhoods shift demographics, daily life resumes its ordinary pace. Yet beneath that visible transformation, there remains an intangible awareness that certain periods altered how people understood their environment. That awareness does not dominate, but it persists like a faint imprint that never fully disappears even when it is no longer actively thought about. For those who lived through the events directly, the passage of time has not erased the weight of what occurred. Instead, it has changed its shape. Immediate shock has given way to long-term reflection. The intensity of the moment has softened, but the significance has not diminished. Memory does not function as a static archive. It reorganizes itself around new stages of life, new contexts, new understandings of what was experienced. In that process, what once felt overwhelming becomes something carried rather than relived, but still very much present. One of the most enduring aspects of the case is not the individual at its center, but the way it exposed the fragility of assumptions. People assume continuity in their environments, assume that patterns of safety will remain stable because they have always appeared that way. When that assumption is disrupted, even temporarily, it forces a recalibration that can last far beyond the event itself. Doors are still locked, lights are still checked, routines still followed, but now with an added layer of awareness that such actions are not meaningless rituals, but responses shaped by historical experience. In academic and investigative contexts, the case continues to be referenced as an example of how complex behavioral patterns can emerge across time and space without immediate detection. It illustrates the importance of connecting fragmented data, of recognizing that isolated incidents may belong to larger sequences, and of maintaining systems that allow for rapid synthesis of information across agencies. These lessons have been absorbed into training, into procedural frameworks, into the evolving language of forensic investigation. Yet, even with these advancements, there remains a recognition that no system can fully eliminate uncertainty. Human behavior retains variability that resists complete prediction. That reality is not a failure of science or law enforcement. It is a boundary condition of working with human systems at all. Culturally, the case occupies a space that requires careful navigation. It is part of public history, but also part of personal history for those affected. It has been discussed, analyzed, and referenced in multiple contexts, yet responsible engagement with it demands a focus that avoids reducing it to spectacle. The emphasis, when handled thoughtfully, shifts toward impact, toward the lives altered, toward the structural responses that followed. This shift is not about diminishing the figure at the center of the case, but about ensuring that the weight of interpretation is distributed appropriately across all dimensions of what occurred. Over time, even the emotional language surrounding the case has changed. Where there was once immediacy, there is now reflection. Where there was once fear, there is now understanding shaped by distance. But distance does not mean detachment. It simply means that the story is no longer lived in real time, but remembered and analyzed in retrospect. That distinction matters because it allows for both processing and learning without re-entering the intensity of the original moment. The physical absence of the individual does not erase the consequences of his actions. It only removes the ongoing threat from the present tense. What remains is the accumulation of effects, distributed across individuals, systems, and cultural memory. These effects are not static. They continue to influence how similar situations are approached, how information is shared, how vulnerability is assessed. In that sense, the case continues to function as more than history. It functions as a reference point for adaptation. Ultimately, what this story reveals is not a single explanation, but a network of interconnected realities. It shows how environments shape perception, how perception influences behavior, and how behavior, when left unchecked within certain conditions, can produce outcomes that reverberate far beyond their origin. It also shows how societies respond, how they adjust, and how they attempt to integrate even the most difficult experiences into a broader framework of understanding. The night, which once carried an unusual weight during those years, has returned to its ordinary form. Streets are active, homes are lit, life proceeds in its familiar rhythm. But within that ordinariness, there is a quiet residue of awareness, a recognition that normality is something maintained rather than assumed. And within that recognition lies perhaps the most lasting outcome of all. Not fear, not fascination, but a deeper understanding of how fragile and resilient human systems can be at the same time, and how both qualities exist together in the spaces people inhabit every day.